30 years ago, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in return for security assurances, which were given by Moscow, Washington, and London when it relinquished its nuclear arsenal to Russia in 1994. Now, the war-torn country wants ironclad protection from its allies as NATO leaders meet in the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius. More than 500 days since the war broke out in Ukraine, Kyiv has pressed to become a part of the military alliance. It sees it as a boost to deter the Russian aggression. But Ukraine's largest Western allies are still finalizing a joint framework that will pave the way for long-term security assurances for Kyiv. The United States and Germany are wary of any move that might take the alliance closer to war with Russia. The big hurdle for Ukraine to become a part of the alliance is the ongoing war. Ukraine knows it will not get entry into the alliance while the war with Russia continues because under Article 5, an attack on one member is an attack on all and would push the alliance into war with Russia. In the meantime, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says that the Vilnius summit must confirm Ukraine a de facto member of NATO, as the majority of NATO members have stood together with his country. Zelensky expects that weapons supply for Ukraine in its war against Russia would also be discussed at the summit. Although Secretary General of NATO Jens Stoltenberg has said that Kyiv will not become a member while the war rages, and the summit will not issue a formal invitation like they did for Finland and Sweden, who were invited to join the alliance directly bypassing the membership action plan. While Finland became a NATO member recently, Sweden is also said to be given membership after Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan met with the Swedish Prime Minister and NATO Secretary General for talks on Sweden's membership, following which Stoltenberg announced that Turkey had agreed to move ahead with Sweden's NATO bid. Take a listen.
I have just had a constructive meeting with President Erdogan and Prime Minister Kristersson. I am glad to announce that as a result, President Erdogan has agreed to forward the accession protocol for Sweden to the Grand National Assembly as soon as possible, and work closely with the Assembly to ensure ratification.
Although for Ukraine to become a part of the alliance might seem like a long road ahead, the Biden administration is reportedly considering proposing an Israeli model for Ukraine in NATO. It is a security model that Western leaders, including the U.S. president, have compared with what Israel has now, a deal that would be a limited commitment and not include a collective defense guarantee. According to reports, the White House would pledge to continue providing more military aid to Ukraine regardless of the outcome of its ongoing counteroffensive. The deal would likely be for a shorter period than the commitment to Israel, which typically runs in 10-year intervals. Moreover, on the sidelines of the summit, an announcement is expected to come from Ukraine's key allies. According to reports, the declaration from most of the G7 leaders will be on an agreement to launch negotiations with Kyiv on a collection of bilateral security commitments. These will be aimed at bolstering Ukraine's ability to defend itself and deter future Russia aggression. Okay, for more on this, we are being joined by Greg Swenson from Chicago. He is the founder of Brig McAdam and an expert on international affairs. Greg, thank you so much for joining us on WION. So it seems that Ukraine is adamant to at least have some sort of pathway into NATO. However, that's very unlikely considering what we know about Article 5 and also the ongoing war. Do you think that there is room right now for some kind of negotiation where some sort of ceasefire or an end to the war can be discussed between NATO and Ukraine, and then ultimately Ukraine and Russia?
Sure. I don't think there's ever a bad time for negotiating and trying to put an end to, either put an end to the war or at least have a ceasefire and further negotiation. So I don't think there's ever a bad time for that as long as it's done through the proper channels. I didn't really agree with the back channel conversations that went about in New York last week. But I think it's important to mention that, this right now, NATO membership for Ukraine is not just unlikely or impossible because they don't have the votes for it, frankly, but also it's a bit of a distraction, so it puts some pressure or undermines NATO cohesion. It also stimulates or supports one of the Russian arguments, the original Russian arguments for the war. Not that you have to agree with that, but it's one that I would think NATO membership or the discussion of NATO membership for Ukraine will actually help Russia sustain that argument. And then thirdly, it's really a distraction from much higher priority issues. One of which you mentioned, which is trying to put an end to this war, immediately. And then secondly, you have some real weak spots in NATO right now that are not being addressed, or at least not being addressed successfully, which is the fact that all but 7 of the 32 NATO countries are not spending 2% of their GDP on defense spending. So there are real bigger issues. And again, I think the Ukraine discussion, as far as membership goes, is just a distraction.
Absolutely. And you mentioned 7 by next year. Even NATO itself admits, although it sees it as a victory, only 11 of the 30, right, well, now maybe 32, will be able to meet those targets. So, one has to wonder, what is the end goal here, at least in terms of the United States moving forward with its foreign policy regarding Russia and Ukraine? On the one hand, it doesn't want to be a party to the war. As you mentioned, these back channel negotiations were in an accident that happened here in New York because it didn't want to directly be involved in these negotiations. And then there's reports of cluster munitions now being right sent to Ukraine. So can you talk about where does the U.S. stand? Is there a plan?
Well, that's the problem. So far, the U.S. support of Ukraine has been very incremental in nature. The President Biden and the administration has really, in many ways, they're constantly dragging their feet and really playing defense instead of getting ahead of this. Some of the munitions and long-range missiles that are finally being delivered, as well as F-16s, should have been done 500 days ago when this war began. So I think the incrementalism has been a real problem for the Biden administration and for their support of Ukraine. And secondly, the talk about bad timing. Yes, there will be 11 members of NATO spending at least 2% of GDP in the next year, or by 2025, which you pointed out. The problem is that the United States, which is clearly the most important member of NATO from a defense perspective, is cutting defense spending. There's a 3% cut in Biden's defense budget. That's really bad timing and dangerous for not only for the U.S., but dangerous for the world.
What an excellent point. Absolutely. Greg Swenson, thank you so much for joining us on WION, and we look forward to having you again very soon.
Thanks a lot. Great to be here.